Mr. Speaker, a little more than 3 months ago, you tasked the Committee on House Administration with a great responsibility to undertake a comprehensive review of the training, policies, and mechanisms to guard against sexual harassment in the congressional workplace. I believe that the legislation we're considering today, H.R. 4924, the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 Reform Act, and immediately following that, the House resolution, together respond to this great task. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, for his leadership on this issue and for the trust he placed on our committee to conduct this important review. I'd also like to thank and appreciate the work done by our committee, our conference chair, Kathy McMorris Rogers. I would also thank every member on the Committee on House Administration, particularly the ranking member, Mr. Brady. He has been a great friend and colleague over the last decade, and I appreciate being able to work closely on this issue with him. Both the CAA Reform Act and the House resolution reflect the dedication and commitment of a bipartisan group of members, including Representatives Burns, Speer, Brooks, and Deutsch, who want to ensure this institution remains worthy of the trust placed in it by the American people. I also want to thank Representatives DeSantis, Love, Comstock, and Chris Smith for their contributions to this bill. As I have said previously and will state again unequivocally, there is no place for sexual harassment or any type of harassment, period, in the U.S. House of Representatives. It is no secret. The culture on Capitol Hill is unique. While there are hundreds of employing offices, we should all share the common goal of creating effective work environments, environments that are safe, productive, collegial, and most important, responsive to the needs of our constituents and the public. During our review, the committee held 2 hearings, 3 member listening sessions, a roundtable discussion with stakeholders, and meetings with victims and their advocates to examine how we could improve the workplace for everyone. We found the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 to be outdated and in need of this comprehensive reform. We found the House training programs to be inadequate in order to meet the needs of all House employees. Additionally, we found that our House policies and procedures are in need of change as it relates to sexual harassment in the workplace. Last November, the House took the first step in addressing these issues by passing H.Res. 630, a resolution that, among other things, requires all House employees to take annual in-person anti-harassment and anti-discrimination training. Passage of the CAA Reform Act is the logical next step. The CAA Reform Act makes a number of important reforms to the Congressional Accountability Act that will ensure its future effectiveness, including reforming the dispute resolution process to establish procedures for initiating, investigating, and resolving alleged violations of Part A, Title II of the CAA, ensuring all claims are filed in writing and are made under oath, requiring members who have engaged in intentional discrimination to reimburse the Department of the Treasury, requiring the Office of Compliance, the OOC, to report every 6 months of a calendar year to Congress and to publish on their website the awards and settlements from the previous year, directing the OOC to conduct a climate survey of the legislative branch every 2 years, directing the OOC to establish a permanent record retention program, expanding the definition of covered employees to include unpaid interns, fellows, and detailees, and clarifying certain commissions such as the Helsinki Commission that they are covered by the Congressional Accountability Act, and providing the process for disposing of claims. These are just a few of the reforms that the CAA Reform Act makes, and I'm proud of the work of this committee and our bipartisan group of members who have worked on this so diligently over the last several months. I would encourage all of my colleagues to support this legislation, and with that I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, since we began this process several months ago, I have met with experts, my colleagues, and most importantly, the survivors of sexual harassment and assault. Their insight has informed this legislation today. By passing this proposal, the Congress will take its much-needed first step in changing how we do business. We eliminate counseling. We eliminate the cooling off period. We make mediation optional. We change the system so that we protect the victim and not the perpetrator. We require more transparency with regular reporting that has meaningful information. We change the confidentiality rules so that the victim decides what to talk about and when. And we hold members accountable for their behavior by referring every case to the Ethics Committee. This is long overdue. But there is one person who has been championing this work her entire career. That gentlelady from California, Representative Jackie Spear, and I thank her. Without her, we would not be here. Representative Spear's leadership and persistence is one of the main reasons why we are so close to getting this done. And the entire Congress should be grateful for her work. And it's because of your leadership, Mr. Chairman, that we are here on the floor today. As you have your entire 10 years on the committee, you have been focused on working together in a bipartisan way where we can agree. And because of that commitment, you will certainly be remembered as one of the most consequential chairmen of this committee. I thank you and I treasure your friendship. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Prior to coming to Congress, I worked for 30 years as a labor and employment attorney in Alabama. I advised clients on how to prevent sexual harassment and how to navigate the process if a harassment claim was made. Quite frankly, I was shocked to see how complicated the congressional process for handling sexual harassment and other employment law claims was. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is a shining example of how Congress should work. Chairman Harper and Ranking Member Brady engaged a bipartisan group of members, including Representative Jackie Spear and myself, interested in solving this problem. After months of thoughtful negotiation, we come to the floor today with a product that this House and the American people can be proud of. Under this legislation, we will bring the congressional workplace into the 21st century and ensure that Congress plays by the same rules as the private sector. There are far too many important reforms to mention all of them, but I want to highlight a few that I think are especially transformative. First, the bill creates a fairer and simpler process for employees to file an employment law claim and for that claim to be resolved. The bill creates an Office of Employee Advocacy to ensure staff has access to legal counsel, just as member offices are provided. The process is also simplified to make the claims process smoother, faster, and fairer. Second, the bill increases transparency by requiring that basic information about any sexual harassment or other claims be made public so the American people are fully aware of what is happening in Congress. Third, the bill will ensure that members of Congress, not taxpayers, are responsible for paying out sexual harassment settlements that they're responsible for. Fourth, the related resolution paves the way for every congressional office to have a clearly defined anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policy. This reform alone will result in greater awareness. Fifth, the resolution prohibits members of Congress from engaging in a sexual relationship with any staff member under their supervision and makes clear that sexual harassment is a violation of the Code of Official Conduct and will not be tolerated. In closing, I want to again thank Chairman Harper and Ranking Member Brady for their leadership on this issue, and I strongly urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation and the related resolution. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from California, and again, the main reason why we're on this floor today, Ms. Spear.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my ranking member for his generosity and for his great leadership. Members, we are truly here on a historic occasion. It is a rare and crucial moment of bipartisanship. This is the way you can do it. Men and women, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals coming together to make this place better. You know, when I first started this work back in 2014, I dreamed, but I did not dare to dream more than to hope that we would end up here today. Today, this bipartisan group of legislators is taking a historic step that has plagued this institution for generations. For years, members of Congress have gotten away with truly egregious behavior. by mistreating their staff. A story that will be etched in my memory forever is a young woman who sat in my office earlier this year and told me her story, and who said, as she cried, the process was almost worse than the harassment. No more, ladies and gentlemen, no more will that be the case. Thanks to the Me Too movement, the American public has made it clear that they have had enough. They expect Congress to lead, and for once we are. Today I'm proud to support the CAA Reform Act based on the Me Too Congress Act, which I introduced last fall. This bill empowers survivors. They will no longer be subject to mandatory mediation. They will be represented by counsel. They will no longer have cooling off periods and periods where they have to be counseled legally. And they have the right to sue. Most importantly, it creates the kind of transparency that we talk about but rarely ever provide. And members, yes, members are going to be held responsible for their bad behavior. And we will require them to pay the settlement in full in 90 days, and if they can't do that, we will garnish their wages, we will garnish their thrift saving plans, and we will garnish their Social Security. We would not be here today were it not for the unwavering commitment of Chairman Harper, Ranking Member Brady, Speaker Ryan, Leader Pelosi, Congressman Byrne, who I have delighted to work with on this issue, Congresswoman Brooks, Congressman Deutsch, and the entire Committee of House Administration. But this would not be here today but for the majority and minority committee staff, especially Jamie Fleet, who has shown extraordinary leadership, as has Kim Betts, for all the late nights and the lost weekends to get this bill over the finish line. And to my staff, who'd worked just as hard, to Molly Fishman and to Miriam Goldstein, I have forever will be grateful for what you do for my... Can I have 30 more seconds?
30 seconds.
I thank you, Mr.
Additional 30 seconds.
The gentlewoman is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
I thank you. But our work is not done. The Me Too movement is driving change from the boardrooms to the break rooms across our great country. I'm committed to ensuring that Congress looks beyond itself to improve the lives of all workers in America. Today we take a great step forward for the congressional workplace. We show that we can come together across party and geography. Tomorrow, let's continue to work to make sexual harassment and violence in all workplace settings a thing of the past. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Indiana, the chairman of our Ethics Committee, Mrs. Brooks.
The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Bipartisan Congressional Accountability Act of 1995, introduced by House Administration Chairman Mr. Harper and the Ranking Member, Mr. Brady. I also want to thank the colleagues who have helped lead the effort, Representative Byrne and Representative Speer, along with my colleague, the Ranking Member of the House Ethics Committee, Representative Deutsch. Current law, the CAA as we call it, was enacted over 20 years ago, and it has become so outdated. The proposed reforms in this Reform Act work to improve our response to harassment and discrimination so that allegations of wrongdoings can be investigated swifter, fairer, and in a more efficient manner. This legislation prioritizes protecting the victims while ensuring due process for the accused. Congress must be a force for justice in order to ensure all employees have a safe workplace environment free of sexual harassment or discrimination of any kind, because it is completely unacceptable to be subjected to harassment or discrimination of any kind at any workplace in our country. The element of the CAA that allowed for silencing of victims and spending taxpayer dollars to settle claims for members of Congress must be changed. The CAA Reform Act will increase the transparency and accountability in Congress and create a more victim-friendly process. It ensures sexual harassment and discrimination settlements made moving forward will no longer be secret. This bill will protect taxpayer dollars by requiring members of Congress who have an award or judgment against them for harassment to personally pay for any settlement. As chairwoman of the House Ethics Committee, I'm proud to work alongside our ranking member, Representative Deutsch, on this important bipartisan legislation. I want to thank our colleagues who worked to ensure that in order for the Ethics Committee to fulfill its obligation to the House to investigate and potentially discipline members and staff, now the committee must be given information on potential bad actors. CAA Reform Act ensures the Ethics Committee is given that information.
Gentleman's time has expired.
30 more seconds.
30, I'll yield 30 more seconds.
The gentlewoman is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. It provides an automatic referral to the Ethics Committee upon disposition of claims before the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights, currently known as Office of Compliance. So now the House Ethics Committee can quickly investigate allegations of wrongdoing while protecting the identity of the accuser and ensuring due process for the accused. By supporting this Reform Act, we're showing the nation that Congress is taking strong bipartisan action to improve the workplace called the People's House and the conduct of those who work in it. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, our Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him and Mr. Harper for their leadership in bringing this legislation to the floor. Congratulations to the House Administration Committee. I recommend Congresswoman Brooks and Congressman Deutsch, their work on the Ethics Committee in this regard. Mr. Raskin, thank you as well. And of course, I want to thank Congresswoman Jackie Speer of California, who has made this part of her life's work and officialdom in her public service in the California legislature and here. And today, the fruit of your labor, Madam Congresswoman, comes to fruition. Your strong leadership will ensure that no survivor of discrimination or harassment will face the injustice of having his or her voice silenced. The Me Too Congress Act is our promise in a bipartisan way to hold every person accountable to the rule of absolutely zero tolerance. No matter someone's contribution to our country, harassment and discrimination are always unacceptable. With this bill, we are shining a blazing light on the scourge of workplace abuse, which has been allowed to fester in the shadows for too long. We are securing protections for all employees by streamlining and strengthening the resolution and reporting process. We are holding members personally responsible for settlements and are guaranteeing taxpayer money will never again be used to create a culture of complicity and silence around workplace harassment. This bill is bipartisan because of the fight against workplace harassment and discrimination transcends party or politics. This legislation is about protecting the personal safety of every person who comes to Congress to serve, either as a member or in the workforce. This is about upholding human dignity and the inalienable right to live free from abuse. Our nation is at a watershed moment in the fight against sexual harassment and discrimination. Brave men and women from Hollywood to Washington, from Sacramento, I might add, where my daughter's been involved in this campaign, from the boardroom to the newsroom, in the hotels, restaurants, and workplaces in every corner of the country, people are standing up to say, time's up. But the Me Too movement, they really have made quite a difference. Their voices are correcting the culture around harassment and abuse. But more needs to be done. The Congress must continue to work with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and others to forge a path forward to improve protection for all American workplaces. That's why I'm so pleased that to bring this bill to the floor over recent time, members of Congress listened to survivors and advocates, learned from public and private sector experts, and received constructive recommendations from many members. We will not rest until every person in every workplace has full safeguards against harassment and abuse and discrimination. This is a time for shaking up the status quo, not for bowing to inaction and incrementalism. Members of Congress are trustees of the people. We have a solemn responsibility to do well by the people, both the people who sent us to Washington and those who serve by our sides here. Our values and our humanity compel us to take action and to finish this fight so that every woman, man, and child can live free from the fear of abuse. Again, I thank you, Mr. Brady, for your leadership on this issue and for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Harper, as well. Yield back.
The gentlewoman from California yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, the Vice Chairman of the Committee on House Administration, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Chairman Harper for his leadership on this important piece of legislation, and I'd be remiss, Mr. Chairman, if I didn't offer my thanks to our House Administration Committee's ranking member, Mr. Brady. Thank you, sir, for your leadership on this important issue, too. And I want to thank my fellow colleagues on that committee for their hard work and diligence. No one should have to worry about sexual harassment when they come to work. This bill is vital to addressing this problem as we work to increase professionalism in the House and establish a workplace that is grounded in respect. In Congress, we've got to lead by example. As a member of this committee, my colleagues and I held hearings on preventing sexual harassment in the congressional workplace and the effectiveness of the Congressional Accountability Act, which demonstrated the need for reform. I'm pleased to report this bill continues the House Administration's committee commitment to increasing transparency in the federal government. Last Congress, we worked hard to pass reforms that made House office spending more transparent and accountable than any other area of the federal government. And today we're voting on a bill that will increase transparency of member conduct by requiring the Office of Compliance to report on awards and settlements every 6 months and by holding members personally responsible. This strengthens the dispute resolution process, enables employees to speak without fear of retribution, and ensures every House office has an anti-discriminatory and anti-harassment policy. For that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote yes and support this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland and a valued member of our committee, Mr. Raskin.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I want to thank our chairman, Mr. Harper, and the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for their excellent leadership on this legislation. I rise as a proud co-sponsor and strong supporter of H.R. 4924, the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 Reform Act, and H.Res. 724, the companion resolution which strengthens anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies and procedures in this institution. These two bills show how Congress can make dramatic progress on a bipartisan basis when we listen to the people, specifically the Me Too movement against workplace discrimination and harassment that has swept America into the 21st century by demanding equality and dignity in the workplace for all women as well as all men. This continuing women's march across America for workplace fairness has forced the members of this body to acknowledge that here in Congress, sexual harassment has been a serious occupational hazard for thousands of women who only want to come to work, to support their families, and to contribute to the common good of the country. We have heard about shameful cases of quid pro quo harassment, hostile workplace environment, groping, forcible kissing, sexual coercion, and reprisal and retaliation for saying no or complaining. As the representatives of the American people, we have a compelling obligation to lead America to a culture of zero tolerance for sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. And we in Congress must lead not only by strong legislation, but by strong example. Our current dispute resolution process is stacked against victims, requiring people to go through a protracted and duplicative process. Members are provided legal counsel while victims are left to navigate this convoluted process on their own. Settlements, if provided, are paid for with taxpayer money instead of the money of the perpetrators of the offense. This legislation eliminates protracted mandatory waiting periods. It empowers victims to move directly to a court proceeding if they so desire. It creates an Office of Employee Advocacy with lawyers on hand to help people understand their rights. It prohibits sexual relationships. Could I request 30 seconds more?
30 seconds.
It prohibits sexual relationships between members of Congress and their staffs, and it holds offending members personally responsible for their conduct by requiring that they pay any settlements that are actually made. I thank Chairman Harper and Ranking Member Brady for their leadership, and especially Congresswoman Jackie Spear for her untiring and exemplary advocacy over the years on this issue. I am glad that we are being part of this great cultural paradigm shift in America right now. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Virginia, Mrs. Comstock, who continues to work tirelessly on this issue.
The gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for all of my colleagues on the committee and all of those who have participated in this process, on this bill and this resolution. I rise in support of both the bill and the resolution. We know sexual harassment is about power, a misuse of power that impacts careers, lives, and self-esteem. We know most women do not come forward and disclose sexual harassment. We know often they leave their desired careers because of that. We've seen it in all industries. Predators such as Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, Matt Lauer, Roger Ailes, Charlie Rose in the media, John Conyers and Trent Franks in our own body. So it is so important that this legislation, this historic step, is fundamentally changing that balance of power by creating an office for the victims, the Office of Employee Advocacy. This is the single most important thing in this legislation to restore that balance of power that has been misused by those in power. When I spoke to Dorina Bertucci, who 30 years ago was sexually harassed in this body by Congressman Jim Bates of California, she didn't have an office to go to. She didn't even have one that wasn't very good. So now, 30 years later, we are writing this. We now have transparency. People can't hide behind the process anymore. The members' names will be known, and taxpayers will not be on the hook for any of this. The offender themselves will have to pay, and we have all types of methods in here to get that money because we want to make sure the victim is made whole. I appreciate we've also adopted some of the DeSantis provisions to get a full accounting of past cases so we know the amounts and we know exactly what happened. And I'm still concerned about those members who may have used their MRAs, their member allowances, in an inappropriate way. That is corrected in this bill and is no longer allowed. Also, we've made it clear that there are no relationships with subordinates. I do want to mention that I still do believe, despite this is a great bill and I heartily support it and so appreciate all the hard work that the staff and everyone has done, but I still do believe we need to disclose the past names that are still unknown. Some of those names have come forward because of the press, because of victims speaking out. We need to let the victims know that they can speak out from the past. If they want to speak out, they can. That this body is not going to be using any of our resources to stop a victim from the past from speaking out. And I also do think we still need to disclose all of those names going forward so that we have full accountability, because part of that misuse of power is that they can continue to know they won't be held accountable, and the victims see that. And so we need to have a strong message that there's nobody in this body that would ever be allowed to go forward without being held accountable. And I thank you and encourage all of my colleagues to support this resolution and this important legislation, and I yield back.
The time of the gentlewoman has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, American culture experienced a moment of reckoning. It doesn't matter what political party, it doesn't matter what industry, it doesn't matter when or where, sexual harassment and sexual violence are unacceptable. America has been willfully blind to abuses of power for far too long. The bravery of survivors of sexual assaults and harassment has changed that, changed our country, and it's time for Congress to follow their lead. I'm grateful to introduce this bill with my colleagues, House Administration Chairman Harper and Ranking Member Brady, my counterpart on the House Ethics Committee, Chairwoman Susan Brooks, all of whom worked so hard to develop these reforms. I want to thank Representative Byrne for his commitment to this effort, sharing his experience. And my colleague and friend, Congresswoman Jackie Speer, deserves particular appreciation and acknowledgement for her strong leadership, not just in crafting this bill, but throughout her career in standing up for the rights of women, but in this case for crafting a bill that will produce lasting change for the United States Congress. This bill will allow survivors to speak out, ensure that legal resources are available to them, and offer justice without fear of retribution. This bill will not only strengthen our out-of-date workplace protections, but it will send an important message to the entire country that members of Congress will be held accountable. With this legislation, also the Office of Compliance must provide the House Ethics Committee with all of the information required for the transparent pursuit of full accountability. It is time to end protections for powerful abusers and to empower survivors. Each survivor must be heard, allegations must be taken seriously, and abusers and harassers must be held accountable. Every congressional employee and every American deserves the equal chance at success in their careers, free from sexual harassment and free from retaliation for defending themselves and asserting their rights. It's time to do the work necessary to change our culture. I encourage my colleagues to support this bill and ensure that Congress does its part in that important work.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire of the time remaining for debate?
The gentleman from Mississippi has 6 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Pennsylvania has 9.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, when news broke that there had been a series of secret sexual harassment payments paid for on behalf of members of Congress by tax dollars, I think a lot of Americans, even by the low standards that they have for this body, were shocked to hear that. And it was almost as if the rules were set up to incentivize bad behavior by member, because members could harass people and they wouldn't be personally liable for it, and they keep it all secret. So this had to change, and I applaud Chairman Harper for leading on this bill, and I'm happy that the provisions of my bill have been adopted in this, because I think it's important. Taxpayers should not bail members of Congress out for misconduct, and this bill fixes that and makes them personally liable. We also need a full accounting of any payments that are being made with tax dollars. This bill does that, and we have to protect identities of victims. And so I think we're making a step in the right direction. I think this starts to foster a culture of respect on Capitol Hill. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I thank the Chairman Harper for his efforts. I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Ask permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank both sides for the bipartisan way in which this bill is passed, true to what it is in this country, bipartisan. Today, the House is doing no more than bringing itself in line with what we have long required of the public sector and federal agencies. When I became chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the late 70s, sexual harassment was not even recognized as a form of employment discrimination. We remedied that with sexual harassment guidelines, later ratified by the Supreme Court. In drawing the sexual harassment guidelines, it never occurred to us that Congress would adopt special procedures for themselves, preferential to members and prejudicial to employees. The anti-discrimination statutes typically require some kind of resolution before we move formally forward, but the current process creates multiple steps and time frames that exhaust complainants and deter resolution. It takes courage to file a sexual harassment complaint because most are unwitnessed and they're difficult to corroborate. The most important provisions of this bill, I believe, are the provisions for legal assistance to complainants, which members have long had, and personal liability for sexual harassment lying with the member, not the taxpayers. This bill marks the Congress holding itself accountable to the public. It is another, however, it is another in line of public focus on high-profile workplaces. I ask the House to move next to the workplaces of America where the average woman and man works, hospitality, factories, offices, and retail. Increasingly, we find sexual harassment widespread. I hope the House will pass my bill to create a national commission to hear from ordinary workers so that the average worker gets our equal attention and equal time. Again, I thank the sponsors of this bill for this bipartisan effort.
The time of the gentlewoman has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Utah, Mrs. Love.
The gentlewoman from Utah is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank Chairman Harper and also Ranking Member Brady for including the STOP Act in the House administration legislation. Shockingly, the Office of Compliance confirms that hundreds and thousands of dollars have been paid with taxpayer money to settle sexual harassment cases against members of Congress. I am pleased to say that the bill that is before us today incorporates a bill that I introduced last December to stop this practice. H.R. 4674, the Stop Taxpayers' Obligations to Perpetrators of Sexual Harassment Act, will require members of Congress to pay back any taxpayer money used to settle sexual harassment cases. Victims will be compensated, but taxpayers won't be footing the bill. This bill promotes and supports due process. It sends a message that there isn't a set fund out there paid for by the taxpayer ready for someone to access. But it also doesn't encourage a member who feels that they've done nothing wrong to settle so an issue can just go away. If a member of Congress behaves badly, the consequences of those actions are that person's responsibility, not the taxpayers. I believe that members should live by the laws that they create, and the taxpayers should not be responsible for inappropriate behavior. I'd like to thank you, and I encourage my colleagues to vote for this bill. Thank you.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to reserve.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
First of all, let me begin, Mr. Speaker, by thanking Chairman Harper for this outstanding bipartisan legislation, and Mr. Brady as well. This is what this place can produce when we do come together. Obviously, it provides congressional employees with comprehensive protection from abuse, including zero tolerance for sexual harassment. The bill significantly increases transparency on member conduct by publishing reports on awards and settlements, and it holds members personally financially responsible, ending the charade of having taxpayers foot the bill for abuses. Very, very significantly, the new Office of Employees Advocacy, which the legislation creates, will provide free legal services to congressional employees. That is absolutely critical, Mr. Speaker, that House employees have a dedicated advocate to consult, assist, and to represent them. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman Harper for including my bill, H.R. 4393, as Section 303 of this bill. This section makes clear that employees of the Helsinki Commission and the China Commission, both of which I co-chair, are covered by the CAA. In 2011, Mr. Speaker, an employee, a woman employed by the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, filed suit making sex harassment and workplace retaliation allegations directed to a former chairman of the Commission. When I learned that the woman was being told, the woman who lodged the complaint, that the CAA did not apply to her, I immediately, as chairman, changed that policy. I deemed it. Thankfully, I checked with the House Counsel, and I had the full backing of the House Counsel. I thought it was unconscionable that this person was told not only did she not have representation, which again the Harper bill now provides, but the CAA itself did not cover her. That was a terrible, terrible wrong. That will be rectified forever by this legislation. Again, I want to thank Chairman Harper for his leadership. This is a remarkable bill, an important bill, and will protect employees from abuse. Yield back the balance.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Let me thank the ranking member, Mr. Brady, and acknowledge his long-standing leadership and friendship, and as well the work that he does with the chairman and for his leadership as well. This is a highlight on the floor of the House for the bipartisanship that it represents, the tone of which we are speaking, even though we know that this is a matter of urgency, and we have seen the telling of situations that none of us would want to see repeated. And forgive me for using more of a most recent set of circumstances just to capture the intensity of the moment, and that is, of course, the recent trial with a conspicuous and vile sex offender to the 200-plus young women athletes. Now, this is not the circumstances here in the House of Representatives, but I think it captures the intensity of silence, because those young women had to live, or thought that that was what they were obligated to do, because they wanted to achieve greatness in their field. And they were stopped by the wall of silence, and therefore could not find relief. The courts have finally given them relief, but through an enormity of pain. I think it is important for the congressional standards to be such that it sets a wide net across the nation to be able to ensure that the wall of silence is broken. So I support H.R. 4924 to amend the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 to reform the procedures provided under such act for the initiation, investigation, and resolution of claims alleging that employing officers of the legislative branch have violated the rights and protections provided to their employees under such act, including protection against sexual harassment and other purposes. So this bill will provide a broader subpoena authority to the Office of Compliance, which adjudicates workplace disputes, and as well it will provide, Mr. Speaker, would expand protections in other areas of anti-discrimination. Let me say that this is a positive statement made by all of us, and I ask my colleagues to support H.R. 4924. I yield back.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the House Ethics Committee, I rise in strong support of this legislation and resolution combating the scourge of sexual harassment. I commend the leadership of Chairman Harper and of Representative Jackie Speer, a national leader on this issue for many years. From this day forward, if a lawmaker commits an act of sexual harassment and breaks the trust of the people, that information will be made public and taxpayers will not foot the bill. I am pleased that this legislation mirrors my bill that would increase governmental transparency and accountability concerning taxpayer-financed harassment settlements in Congress. The people who come forward to serve this country, particularly young people, need to know that protections are in place and that offenders, no matter how powerful, will face accountability. Congress must be an exemplar for the nation on this important issue. And I encourage other institutions in this country, business, labor, Hollywood, and the press, to examine their own practices to ensure a safe workplace. Now is the time for action and results. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi has only 30 seconds remaining and has the right to close. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I'm prepared to close if the chairman is prepared to close. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I give myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized for such time.
Mr. Speaker, this is an important day for the House of Representatives. Republicans and Democrats from all different parts of the country have come together to make meaningful change in how Congress operates. As I conclude, I'd like to thank the staff that worked so hard on this, especially Kim Betts, Molly Fishman, Miriam Goldstein, members of my staff, Terry Morgan, and my staff director, Jamie Fleet. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your leadership, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation before us now. And Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania has yielded back all time for the minority. The Gentleman from Mississippi, the chairman of the committee, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a historic moment for the House of Representatives, and I too want to thank Kim Betts for her hard work on our staff, as well as Jamie Fleet, the staff director. And particularly, I want to give a special thanks to Jackie Spear and Bradley Byrne for the many hours they have spent working through this process for us. This makes historic and important steps in the House of Representatives. It brings us that step closer to achieving our goal of creating effective and safe work environments, environments that are safe, productive, collegial, and most importantly, responsive to the needs of our constituents and the public. There's no place like the House of Representatives. This should be, for every employee, the most special place that they will ever work. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4924, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The time of the gentleman from Mississippi has expired. All time has now expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4934 as amended, 4924. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I have that card covered. Says the gentleman from Mississippi, seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 724, requiring each employing office of the House of Representatives to adopt an anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policy for the office's workplace at all.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 724, resolution requiring each employing office of the House of Representatives to adopt an anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policy for the office's workplace, establishing the Office of Employee Advocacy to provide legal assistance and consultation to employees of the House regarding procedures and proceedings under the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brady, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time.
Mr. Speaker, this is the second measure before us today. The House resolution makes a number of administrative reforms to the House, including requiring each employing office of the House to adopt anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies for the office's workplace, establishing within the Chief Administrative Officer an Office of Employee Advocate who will provide legal consultation, representation, and assistance to House employees, directing members to certify that the member's representational allowance is not being used to settle or pay an award under the Congressional Accountability Act. In addition, the resolution makes a number of changes to the Code of Official Conduct that together will strengthen the House's policies on sexual harassment. The House resolution is a critical piece of the comprehensive reform package needed to strengthen the policies, procedures, and mechanisms to guard against and respond to sexual harassment claims in the congressional workplace. I encourage my colleagues to support this important resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time.
Mr. Speaker, this resolution continues the work we started in legislation we just considered. It makes much needed improvements to how the House operates. It requires every office to have an anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policy. It provides legal counsel for our House employees who need assistance in fighting harassment in their offices. It strengthens our code of conduct, the ethics rules we live by, to make clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated, and bans the use of the MRA for paying settlements. I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation, and again, I'd like to thank my chairman for his cooperation. As always, we work together, and as you can see, when we work together, things get done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to certainly thank the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for the great bipartisan work and his friendship in making this possible to get these important things done. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.